Welcome to Love Your Neighbor and Get Vaccinated webinar series. And today our particular focus will be on reducing vaccine hesitancy. I'm David DeCoste, the Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And I'm joined today with my colleague, Charles Binkley, and I'll let Charles introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Charles Binkley. I'm a physician and bioethicist, and I direct the bioethics program at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University.
Thanks, Charles. Great to be doing this with you. And the project Get Vaccinated project is a joint one between the Markkula Center and Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County. And we're also very grateful for the participation and guidance of the California Catholic Conference. So today's webinar is the first webinar in a series over the next weeks and months on COVID-19 vaccines and the applied and ethical issues related to them. So we want to just note that this is a crucial time, of course, in the pandemic in the United States and in California. The numbers of infections and deaths are way down. The number of vaccinations are going up. California itself announced its reopening on Tuesday. So in some sense, we're all kind of worn out, we're wary, and we're exhilarated at the same time. So in a way, we can let our guards down now. If you're fully vaccinated in the state of California, the word is take off your mask. But in another sense, we've really got to keep focused because there are lingering older issues and there are new important issues that are coming up related to vaccines, their application, and ethical and legal questions. So we're offering this webinar series in the spirit of those old and new questions certain to be coming up in the next weeks and months. Today, we're going to focus on one particular slice of those sets of issues, and that is the questions related to why are people still resisting taking vaccines, the topic known as vaccine hesitancy. And we're approaching this in particular in terms of some of the medical and ethical arguments that are very common that we hear in California and around the country around that issue. So first, we're going to walk through some data related to the pandemic to kind of get us all in the room. Where are we at now? And then we're going to get into some of those specific arguments. So we welcome your questions, your comments. Please send them to us. We'd love to pose them and make them part of this conversation today. We also welcome your suggestions and ideas for topics for webinars in the next weeks and months. What we really like to do is make this webinar a place where people can come and collaborate, share ideas for how to address these emerging issues with all kinds of kind of applied and ethical topics attached to them. So first, let's take a look at some of the data. Where are we at in this really just all but unprecedented situation in our country? Here is the data from the United States. As you can see, we've almost had 600,000 people die over the last year plus from this virus. As you can see, the numbers of deaths, well, we don't have a comparison data here, but are vastly lower, I think, than we all know they were back not terribly long ago. So, Charles, does anything jump out at you in terms of this data?
You know, David, really is the sheer vastness of the number of people affected by this virus. And in such a short amount of time, I mean, 15, 16 months ago, this was just something that we sort of vaguely heard about in the news. And for it to go in such a short period of time to something that has really affected everyone very profoundly in many cases, it just the sheer amount of suffering associated with these numbers really strikes me, particularly how this has disproportionately affected vulnerable populations in the United States and has really showed some of the rifts between those who have and those who have not, those who are able to access healthcare and those who aren't able to access healthcare, those who have very high quality healthcare with a great chance of recovery and those with lesser high quality or even no healthcare.
Thanks so much, Charles. Amana, the next slide, please. Okay, yes, here we go. So, I think we have to go back a couple, Amana, and here we go. So here's the overall vaccination data for the United States. So we can see a little more than half the population has one dose, just under half is fully vaccinated. So, Charles, let me ask you here, what is the importance, what is this concept called herd immunity, and what is its relevance to the data we're looking at for the entire United States?
Well, David, we want to get as many people vaccinated as possible, but there is this critical threshold that we typically think about in terms of vaccines, that over a certain level, because vaccines are not always 100% effective. In this case, with these particular vaccines, all the vaccines are 100% effective at preventing deaths related to COVID. But still, we want to get as many people as possible vaccinated in order to ensure that that we basically have this critical mass that have been vaccinated, receive full vaccine, and that if there were to be small outbreaks for people who can't be vaccinated, so for instance, there may be some legitimate medical reasons why people can't get vaccinated, by having all the people around them that have already been vaccinated, you really protect them from contracting the virus. And so really that's how herd immunity is playing out in this particular instance.
Great, thank you. The next slide, Amana. All right, so here's overall data for California. You can see 62,000 deaths, an awfully high amount, although relative our population, relative to many other states, California fared a little bit better there. Charles, anything jump out to you about the data for the state of California here?
Well, as Californians, we sometimes can think of that our way is always the best way. And I think in this case, it was really, we shut down, at least, I live here in San Francisco. San Francisco shut down very quickly. The culture within the city was very observant of regulations, masking, social distancing, limiting the number of people in places like grocery stores. And so I really do think that we have, what this data reflects is that those measures worked, that we prevented the transmission of the virus very effectively, both within our cities and within the state.
Great, the next slide, please. So here's the data for vaccination for California. As you can see, we're doing a little better than the national average here, and with almost 60% with one dose and almost 50 of fully vaccinated population. And Charles, again, anything jump out at you about the California vaccination data?
Well, I think, California is such a densely populated state and also has a large population. And the fact that we've been so successful, again, in a relatively short period of time, when you think about when the vaccines were first rolled out, and to be able to operationalize this, to actually get injections in people's arms, this is really quite revolutionary. Again, we went in 16 months from this being just a virus that we had heard about to actually 60% of people being vaccinated. I think that's really a great thing that we were able to do the research, the development, and then operationalize it and actually get vaccinations in people's arms. But we have to continue that momentum. This isn't the time for us to stop and to think, well, we don't need to worry about this anymore. We have to keep the momentum up.
Great, thank you. The next slide, please. Okay, so we know also that California has announced on Tuesday that it was sort of officially reopened, meaning the state, removed some very specific legal limits on all sorts of behaviors. And here are three we noted that are especially important: no physical distancing restrictions, no capacity limitations for indoor or outdoor settings, and no masks required for fully vaccinated individuals. Charles, anything strike you about either these claims or other aspects of the California reopening?
But I think this reflects our success at getting people vaccinated, because there's this critical number of people that you need to have vaccinated in order to reduce the restrictions on things like gatherings, enforcing mask wearing, and capacities. So the fact that we were able to reach those numbers, we were able to get that many people vaccinated in such a short period of time, really allowed us to relax some of these restrictions. Again, these restrictions were initially put into place not only to save lives, but also not to overwhelm our health system.
Great, thank you so much. And now, I think that's the end of our slide presentation. We just wanted to put that, oh, I'm sorry, we have one more slide. I'm sorry. If the next slide, please. And so we just wanted to show here, this is data as of late May. Now, these are cities in California with low vaccination rates. So remember, California overall has 47% fully vaccinated. So these are 10 cities taken from the state of California data showing low vaccination rates. So we just put these up here, not to blame these cities, many people working hard in all these places to deal with these matters, but I think it's good to reflect on if the state has 47% fully vaccinated, we see cities here where we don't even have 10% of the population vaccinated. And I think that brings home the challenge that remains for us in the state of California regarding vaccination. Great. Well, thank you so much for the slides here. And we now want to move into a more specific discussion of the arguments, ideas, thoughts people have for why they're not getting vaccinated. And I really, again, invite those listening, if you have questions around this, issues you've come up against that you'd like us to address, please send them into the chat, get them to us, and we'd love to kind of get to them in the course of our conversation. So we brainstorm a number, and here's, and actually before we get into those, I did want to just start by asking Charles, to me, a very important question, which is, Charles, what are sort of the kind of medical reasons that someone very reasonably wouldn't get vaccinated for?
That's a great question, David. Probably the most legitimate medical reason to not get vaccinated is if you have had an allergic reaction to vaccines in the past. And typically it's not the vaccine itself. There's some ingredient within the vaccine that one has an allergic reaction to. But that's probably what that would be the most reasonable grounds for saying that you have a medical exemption or that you have some concern medically to not get the vaccine. But there are also ways to pre-treat people, even if they've had a reaction in the past, to pre-treat them before they get a vaccine in the future to reduce the risk that they would have an allergic response. The incidence of a severe allergic reaction to the vaccines is about 1 in a million. And to put it into context, the incidence of a severe allergic reaction to penicillin, the very common medication that most everyone has taken, is about 1 in 10,000. And so much, much safer than penicillin from an allergic perspective. There's also other non-allergic reactions to vaccines. There's a syndrome called Guillain-Barré. And so anyone who's had a history of Guillain-Barré or other neuromuscular disorders, and these are extraordinarily rare, but they should also at least consult with a healthcare provider before getting the vaccine. And in some cases, that would serve as a legitimate reason why not to be vaccinated. Pregnant people should also consult with their healthcare providers before getting the vaccine. This doesn't mean that pregnant people shouldn't get the vaccine. It means that there should be a conversation beforehand. There's no live virus in any of the vaccines, and that's typically the reason why pregnant people should get a vaccine, is because there's live virus in many vaccines, but there's no live virus in any of these vaccines.
Charles, can I also ask, because I've seen this in news reports about some, say, sports figures and others who have had a history of cancer and have chosen not to get vaccinated. Now, I know in your other life, so to speak, you are a cancer surgeon. On what grounds, like, why is it that someone who may have cancer might pause or hesitate or choose not to get vaccinated?
Well, so whenever anybody's has cancer or is actively in cancer treatment, you always have to be circumspect before introducing anything. I mean, there are people who are under cancer treatment who really can't even brush their teeth because of the risk that they would seed bacteria during the process of brushing their teeth. So really all activities in someone who's actively undergoing cancer treatment should be discussed with a physician. There's a balance here. One of the concerns about immunizing anybody with cancer undergoing cancer treatment has to do with whether their immune system is going to be activated or not by the vaccine. So you wouldn't want to give a vaccine to someone who's not going to be able to mount an immune response, because that would give them a false sense that it's been effective, right? So if one isn't able to actually mount the immune response that the vaccine is meant to trigger because they're immunosuppressed, then they would have this false sense of, well, I've gotten a vaccine, I don't have to wear my mask anymore, I don't have to socially distance. And so we don't want to give people that false sense. Actually, people who may be vulnerable to COVID and are at risk of having a more severe effect should probably be the first to get vaccinated. So again, this is one of those risk benefit sort of considerations that really an oncologist or physician treating those patients should best guide those decisions. So the message is that having cancer, being in cancer treatment, isn't an absolute contraindication. Really, it doesn't intrinsically pose a risk to a patient to get the vaccine. The question is whether or not the patient will be able to trigger an immune response.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. And I'd like to move now into some of the more common objections that have come up that are not really so much those kind of medical concerns you've raised. But so a lot of people have said, the vaccines are too risky, they contain COVID, I'm going to get COVID if I take a vaccine. Is that true? What about that argument?
No, David, that's not true. None of the vaccines contain COVID. None of them contain live active virus. There are other vaccines that contain modified viruses that are meant to trigger the immune system, but have basically been cribbled of whatever would make them severe. That's not the case with COVID. So the two mRNA vaccines have basically the ability to make the immune system feel like or believe that it has seen COVID and mount a response in anticipation of seeing it in the future. So the target protein is the spike protein, and that's basically where the virus attaches to our cells within our respiratory tract. And so that's where all of the vaccines have pointed their effectiveness is against this spike protein and interrupt that process, but none of them contain COVID. You can't get COVID from these vaccines.
Charles, another element of the argument about risk is people who have said, well, the side effects are so terrible from the vaccines, I don't want to get it. I don't want to get the vaccine because of the side effects. Or people who have said, I got my first shot of the vaccine in a 2-shot vaccine regimen. The side effects were terrible. I don't want to get my second shot. How does one respond to those concerns?
The instance of really severe side effects is very, very low. People may have some soreness at the injection site. There may be some increased fatigue. Some people have reported headaches. These should all be very mild and self-limited. There have been some very, very rare instances of severe effects, particularly associated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But the risk-benefit ratio is such that these severe reactions are so rare, and if they're detected in time, they can be effectively treated. And the benefit is so much greater than the risk of any of these severe reactions. The other piece of it is that anytime you have a vaccine, you should expect to have some side effects, because that's just your immune system actually working and the vaccine doing what it's supposed to do.
Charles, another claim that people have made is that the vaccines just haven't really been tested very well. We're all a population of, in effect, kind of, guinea pigs for some experiment here. Could you give us a sense, like, what's the basic process that these vaccines have gone through in the United States?
So any vaccine or really any medication goes through several phases of testing. So it's tested in cells, it's tested in animals, and then it's tested in humans, and it's tested in different ways. Essentially, the way that the COVID vaccines have worked is that instead of doing it in a stepwise process, everything was done in parallel. And so the safety was the first concern. Are these safe? And so they were found to be very safe. And then the question is also at the same time, are they effective? And yes, they've been tested in trials and controlled trials comparing getting the COVID vaccine to getting a placebo like sugar water or salt water. They've been shown to be extremely effective, and that's tested in tens of thousands of research subjects who consented to be research subjects. Whenever a medication or a vaccination is rolled out and approved by the FDA, even if it's under an emergency use authorization, we still track safety. So now millions and millions of people have received the vaccine, and there have been no significant safety concerns that have been consistent and replicable that we've seen constantly come up. And so although we tested the vaccine first in tens of thousands, now that millions and millions of people have gotten the vaccines, if there were significant safety concerns, we would know about them.
Charles, many people took note of the fact that the Johnson & Johnson single shot vaccine was taken off the use by the CDC, by the federal government for several days, a month or so ago, because of data related to clotting issues. And I have understand that a lot of people who fear vaccination don't want to take the Johnson & Johnson. They fear its possible consequences. Could you speak to that, please? Like the significance of it being taken out of use and now being back in use and the underlying data that caused that concern.
Right, it really is an abundance of caution. And that's what one always practices when you begin a vaccination program or when you roll out a medication. This is part of our ongoing safety investigation of all drugs. So any drug that you take, if there's a side effect, if there's a complication, these all get reported to the FDA for investigation. And so what happened with the Johnson & Johnson is soon after it was rolled out, there were several instances of clotting disorders. And so the right thing to do is to stop it so that you can investigate. And that investigation was carried out, a very thorough investigation by experts, objective experts outside of the FDA, as well as those within the FDA. And what they looked for was, is this consistent? Are there other risk factors? And what they determined is that the overall benefit of the vaccine is far greater than the risk. So the fact that it was paused is really a sign of how vigilant our organizations are and how thorough they are in protecting our well-being.
And isn't it the case too that now with the supply of vaccines, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna, all out there, if someone is, that it would be fairly easy if someone was offered the Johnson & Johnson to decline that vaccine and ask for another one if they were really concerned. Is that not the case?
Well, that may not be the case at the moment. It may be that the vaccination site one shows up for only has, they're only using the one. You may not have 2 or 3 different vaccines actually mixed and ready to go. So a question would be, what are you administering at that site that day? And they may well be administering what they have. I think it would probably be unusual to be able to step up to the nurse or the technician, the physician giving the vaccines and be able to sort of choose from the syringes they have there, but they may well be using one vaccine that day. And so that would be a question to ask in advance. And it all depends on what the site is. I mean, these mass vaccination sites may have been offering more than one at a time, but now that most people are getting vaccinated in health departments, they're probably only going to have one reconstituted and mixed up that day because they do expire if you mix too many at one time.
Charles, I want to segue into what's in some ways perhaps the most common ethical objection that people have to getting vaccinated. And in formal terms, it's my choice. What business is this of anyone else's, whether I get vaccinated or not? What's a response to that argument?
Well, at the most basic level is that we're all in this together and we're part of a community. using the phrase "no person is an island," and so we all exist in community together, and so we have to look out for one another. There are basic things built into the structure of our society. For instance, we stop at stop signs and at stoplights so we don't harm each other. And the same thing comes true for getting a vaccine. We do it not only for ourselves, but also for others, particularly others who are vulnerable. So for instance, some people, myself included, are continuing to mask in gatherings, not because we're concerned about contracting the virus ourselves, but because there may be people with legitimate medical reasons why they can't get vaccinated. And so I do it as a sign of solidarity with them, because we're all in this together. And so we get vaccinated not just to protect ourselves, but also to protect our neighbors.
Another version of the argument that I've heard a bit is, it's my choice. Why is it? It's not anyone else's business but mine. And since everyone else is getting vaccinated, now there's really no reason for me to get vaccinated. So what's the response to that argument?
Well, we have to have this critical mass, and we saw some of those counties in California where the vaccination rates were extremely low. Those clusters of people remain very, very vulnerable, particularly if you've got a community in which the vaccination rates are only 5 or 10%. You really only need one person coming in with COVID, asymptomatically transmitting it to everybody else in the community, and then that community will transmit it to everyone else because you don't have this critical level of protection. And so again, the idea is that there are lots of things that we don't have choices about in a community, in a society. And part of that we want to be motivated by one's internal moral sense. And part of it is by law. Right now, we're not mandating, society isn't mandating, governments aren't mandating receiving the vaccines. We're hoping that people will do it on their own moral choice, both again, to protect themselves and to protect others.
Our project with Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County has been called Love Your Neighbor, Get Vaccinated. And so, love your neighbor, of course, is perhaps the great ethical command of Christian faith. Charles, how does that command or how does that norm apply to the question of vaccination? What does it mean to love your neighbor as a motive for getting vaccinated?
Well, I think, even beyond sort of the Christian basis of that message is a sense, again, that we're really all in this together. There's this idea of, what is the moral obligation of individuals in society to each other? And at the most basic level, it is to not harm each other. And by not getting the vaccine, in many ways, you're putting others at risk of harm from you. And so again, at the very basic level, we have an obligation, whether you have a spiritual tradition or not to harm each other and not to put each other at undue risk. And by not getting vaccinated, we really do that to each other.
Charles, thank you. And we're almost out of time, but we do have a question here, which is, I'll read it here. So a neighbor of someone watching our webinar here who's 80, the neighbor's 85, fully vaccinated since March, but was hospitalized last week, has since been moved to the ICU and is intubated. Is this a rare occurrence following vaccination? I'm presuming this means this person has COVID and is being intubated for that reason.
I really want to not give advice on this one.
Okay.
I think there are too few facts for me to speculate.
Well, let me say this in a more general sense, because people might say, hey, you can get vaccinated and still get COVID. So what's, like, in a general view of vaccines, like, what's the response to that argument?
Well, let me say you can still be vaccinated and need to be on a ventilator for other reasons. I think that's probably a better way of seeing this this case that we're posed with. You can certainly be vaccinated and still need to be in the ICU or on a ventilator for reasons completely unrelated to either having COVID or receiving a COVID vaccine. So I would separate those out in this particular case. But since I don't know the details, I really don't want to speculate on why the person would be in the ICU or on a ventilator. But it would be very low. It would be very unlikely for this to be either related to the vaccine or to COVID.
I'm struck, Charles, even in your response about with the entire question of vaccine hesitancy, the importance of information and the importance in some ways of, we're getting these days tons of information coming at us of all sorts of different kinds, but really identifying the importance of promulgating trusted and trustworthy information. The anecdote, the single story that we may hear about some really difficult scenario, in a sense, it's always got to get checked out. And it may not well bear out in some ways too. So,
right. I think the big message is that all of the vaccines are 100% effective at preventing death and severe illness from COVID. That's really the take-home message. That's the goal here. People can get asymptomatic infections. You can still get infected with COVID, even though you've had the vaccines, but people will not die from COVID, nor would they wind up, at least in all of the studies that have been done, none of the single participants who received the vaccines wound up on a ventilator in the ICU from COVID after receiving the vaccines.
Right, powerful closing note. So Charles, thank you so much. Always great to work with you. And thank you so much, our great team, Joel, Debbie, and Amana, and Megan, and others. So that is it for today. And of our first webinar of Love Your Neighbor, Get Vaccinated. Our first webinar here is on vaccine hesitancy. And we'd like to continue in the next weeks and months, picking up on this issue a bit more, as well as other aspects of the ongoing vaccination questions related to things, for instance, like schools reopening in the fall and more. So please also visit us at this website of our joint project with Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County. You can see the URL down at the bottom, scu.edu/ethics/get-vaccinated. So thank you so much for being with us. Please get in touch with us with any ideas you have about additional shows down the road. I'm David DeCoste from the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Good day.